I always said, I'm the luckiest woman alive. And I meant it. Adrian laughed and replied, You deserve it, love. I smiled and said, Forever feels easy with you. He kissed my forehead and whispered, Always. I believed those words because my ring sparkled and our friends cheered. Clara squealed, Look at you, future bride. I laughed and said, Stop, you'll make me cry. Adrian added, She cries at everything. I teased, Only when I'm happy. I told everyone, He's my safe place. They nodded and said, You glow. I answered, Love does that. At dinner I asked, Will you be home early tonight? He checked his phone and said, Probably late meetings. I nodded and answered, That's okay, I'll wait. He smiled quickly and said, You're the best. Clara leaned close and whispered, Does he always rush like that? I shrugged and said, Work is stressful. She frowned and replied, Just don't forget yourself. I laughed it off and said, I won't. Later I called Adrian and said, I miss you already. He sighed and answered, Can I call you back? I said softly, Of course. The line went dead before I finished smiling. I told myself, Love needs patience. I reminded myself, Good men get busy. Still my chest felt tight when hours passed. When he finally came home I asked, Long night. He loosened his tie and said, You have no idea. I stepped closer and said, I made your favorite. He kissed my cheek and replied, You spoil me. I watched him scroll his phone and asked, Everything okay? He said, Just emails. I nodded and said, I trust you. He looked up and said, You always do. I planned flowers and colors and vows in my head. I said, I want simple happiness. He replied, I'll give you everything. Clara called and joked, Bridezilla yet? I laughed and said, Never. She paused and said, Promise me you're truly happy. I answered, I am. I ignored the silence between his words. I ignored the distance in his eyes. I chose belief over fear every time. Clara texted, Call me if you need me. I typed back, I'm happy, I promise. I stared at the ceiling and whispered, This is love. I believed in the future we planned aloud. I believed in the man beside me. I believed because believing felt safer than doubt. I had no idea how fragile that belief was. The next morning I asked, Coffee together? He checked the time and said, I'm running late. I forced a smile and replied, Another day then. He said, Soon, I promise. I told myself, promises mean something. I repeated it while tying my shoes. I repeated it while watching him leave. Clara later said, You keep excusing him. I answered, That's what love is. She sighed and replied, Love shouldn't hurt. I laughed and said, It doesn't. That night I said, I booked the venue. He said, Already? I laughed nervously and replied, You said yes. He nodded and said, Of course. I lay beside him and whispered, I can't wait. He murmured, Me too. His back faced me as he slept. I smiled in the dark and thought, This is forever. I held on to that thought like a shield. I didn't know I was protecting a lie. I closed my eyes and whispered, I trust you, Adrian. I believed love was enough. I believed patience would save us. I believed because my heart was louder than my doubts, and I chose hope, even when silence answered me in ways I did not yet understand. I noticed the quiet first, not the noise. I asked Adrian, Why don't you call me during the day anymore? He smiled and said, Work is intense, you know that. I nodded and replied, I just miss you. He kissed my hand and said, Don't overthink. That word stayed with me. Overthink. One night I asked, Who keeps texting you so late? He locked his phone and said, Clients. I laughed softly and replied, At midnight. He frowned and said, Why are you interrogating me? I rushed to say, I'm sorry. He sighed and answered, I love you, okay? Clara noticed my silence and asked, You've been quiet lately. I forced a smile and said, Just tired. She leaned closer and said, Is it Adrian? I shook my head and replied, He's stressed. She said gently, You always defend him. I laughed and said, That's love. At lunch she said, Do you still feel chosen? I paused and answered, "Of course." She studied me and said, "Then why do you look lonely?" I snapped, "You're imagining things." She raised her hands and said, "I just care." At work, Ryan asked, "You okay?" I replied, "Yes." He tilted his head and said, "You've missed 3 deadlines." I whispered, "I didn't notice." He said softly, "That's not like you." I forced a laugh and said, "Wedding stress." Later, Adrian asked, "Why does Ryan keep calling?" I said, "He's my colleague." He replied sharply, "He seems interested." I stared at him and said, "That's unfair." He shrugged and answered, "Just saying." That night I said, "You're distant lately." He replied, "You're sensitive lately." I swallowed and said, "I just want honesty." He smiled calmly and said, "You have it." Clara called and said, "Promise me you won't disappear for him." I answered, "I won't." She said, "You already are." I snapped, "Stop doubting us." She went quiet and said, "I hope I'm wrong." I lay awake and whispered, "Why does love feel heavy?" I told myself, all relationships change. I repeated, "Trust fixes everything." The next day Adrian said, "I booked a trip." I smiled and asked, "Together?" He hesitated and said, "Business." I nodded and replied, "I understand." He kissed my cheek and said, "You always do." Ryan later said, "You deserve peace." I frowned and replied, "I have it." He looked at me and said, "You don't look convinced." I changed the subject and smiled. That evening Clara texted, "Listen to your gut." I typed back, "My heart is louder." I watched Adrian laugh at his phone and asked nothing. I noticed the secrets and called them stress. I felt the distance and named it maturity. I told myself love meant patience. I told myself doubt meant weakness. I told myself silence was normal. I chose trust every time fear knocked. I chose him over my questions. I ignored the warnings because believing felt safer than knowing. I found the truth at 11:47 p.m. when Adrian's phone lit up beside me. I said, "Who is Lena?" He froze and said, "Why are you touching my phone?" I replied, "Answer me." He exhaled and said, "It's not what you think." I laughed and said, "That sentence ruins lives." He snapped, "You're being dramatic." I whispered, "She said she loves you." He rubbed his face and said, "You read my messages?" I said, "You hid them." He stood and said, "You wouldn't understand." I stood too and asked, "Try me." He said, "I was lonely." I replied, "So was I." He said, "You were busy." I asked, "Busy loving you?" He said, "Don't twist this." I said, "You twisted us." He said, "It just happened." I laughed and said, "Affairs don't trip." A woman nearby looked over and whispered, "Are you okay?" I nodded and said, "I will be." Adrian hissed, "Lower your voice." I said, "You didn't whisper with her." He said, "I didn't plan to hurt you." I replied, "You planned to hide." He said, "She meant nothing." I said, "Then why did you risk everything?" He slammed his hand and said, "Because I wanted more." I stared and said, "More than me." He said, "More than this life." I whispered, "I built this life." People stared as I said, "How long?" He hesitated and said, "Months." I felt my chest collapse and said, "While planning our wedding?" He said, "That was complicated." I said, "So am I now." He said, "Don't act innocent." I asked, "What did I do?" He said, "You expected too much." I laughed and said, "Fidelity is too much?" He said, "You wanted perfection." I said, "I wanted honesty." He replied, "I wanted freedom." The word burned as I said, "Then leave." He said, "I didn't mean like this." I answered, "You did." A man nearby stood and said, "Sir, calm down." Adrian grabbed his coat and said, "This is private." I said, "Nothing is private anymore." He whispered, "You'll regret this scene." I said, "I regret trusting you." He said, "You'll never forgive me." I replied, "I already don't recognize you." He walked away and said, "I need space." I said, "Take everything else too." I sat shaking and told myself, "You missed the signs." I argued back, "You loved honestly." I whispered, "That was your mistake." Tears fell as I said, "My life is gone." Another voice inside replied, "No, it just ended." I sat longer watching strangers pretend not to listen. I told myself, "Stand up." I stayed seated and said, "Breathe." My hands trembled as I thought, "You trusted him." Another thought answered, "You trusted love." I whispered, "Love shouldn't hurt like this." I heard myself say, "You gave everything." The silence replied, "And he took it." I wiped my face and said, "I won't beg." I imagined him returning and said, "I won't forgive easily." My chest ached as I admitted, "I feel small." A steadier voice replied, "You survived tonight." I stood slowly and said, "Remember this pain." I added, "Use it." I walked outside and told myself, "This is the end." Another voice corrected, "This is the beginning." I paused and listened to my heartbeat. I said, "You are still here." The night answered nothing. I whispered, "I will rebuild." My tears dried. My anger stayed. My old life ended. I promised myself I would never shrink again, never silence my instincts, and never confuse betrayal for love, even when loneliness tried to convince me otherwise. I chose survival over denial, pain over lies. Forever. I packed one suitcase while Adrian stood silent. I said, "I'm leaving." He replied, "You're overreacting." I answered, "You already lost me." He scoffed and said, "You'll come back." I said, "No." He asked, "Where will you go?" I replied, "Anywhere you aren't." The door closed behind me. I called Clara and said, "I don't know who I am anymore." She said, "Come here." I whispered, "I feel stupid." She replied, "You loved." "That's not stupid." At her apartment I sat on the floor and said, "I built my life around him." Clara said, "Then build it again." I shook my head and said, "I feel small." She said, "You're wounded, not small." I stared at my hands and said, "What if I never recover?" She answered, "You will, even if you crawl." I laughed weakly and said, "I don't feel strong." She replied, "You left. That's strength." At work, Ryan approached and said, "You look exhausted." I said, "I didn't sleep." He asked, "Do you need help today?" I hesitated and said, "Yes." He said, "I'll handle the reports." I said, "Thank you." He added, "No questions." I nodded and said, "That helps more than you know." Later I muttered, "I failed at everything." Ryan said quietly, "You survived something hard." I replied, "It doesn't feel like survival." He said, "It will." In the hallway, Ethan stopped me and said, "Take your time with that presentation." I said, "I'm behind." He replied, "Being human isn't being behind." I looked at him and said, "You don't know what I lost." He said calmly, "I know what rebuilding looks like." I stayed silent. He added, "You don't owe anyone strength." That night I told Clara, "The quiet scares me." She asked, "Why?" I said, "There's no one to distract me from my thoughts." She replied, "Sit with them." I whispered, "What if I deserve this?" She snapped, "No." I asked, "Then why do I feel guilty?" She said, "Because you cared." I stared at the ceiling and said, "I don't know how to start over." Clara said, "Tomorrow." I asked, "And if I fail?" She replied, "Then we try again." I texted Ryan, "Thanks for today." He answered, "Anytime." I replayed Ethan's words and said aloud, "Being human isn't being behind." The room felt empty. I said, "I gave everything." No one answered. I admitted, "I'm afraid." I also said, "I'm still here." I placed my suitcase down and said, "This is mine now." The silence stayed. I breathed and whispered, "I walked away." I didn't feel brave. I felt hollow. But I stood. I woke up and said, "I'm still here." Clara looked at me and asked, "Is that good or bad?" I replied, "I don't know yet." She handed me coffee and said, "You didn't vanish." I said, "I thought about it." She frowned and said, "Don't scare me." I answered, "I'm choosing not to disappear." She sat beside me and asked, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I show up." She smiled and said, "Then start small." At work, Ethan stopped me and said, "You're early." I replied, "I needed structure." He nodded and said, "Structure saves people." I said, "I feel broken." He answered, "Broken things can still function." I asked, "What if I fail again?" He said, "Then you learn faster." Later Clara texted, "Did you eat?" I replied, "Yes." She sent, "Proud of you." I stared at the screen and whispered, "That shouldn't feel big." I looked at my calendar and said, "I need routines." Clara said, "Gym tomorrow." I groaned and said, "I hate you." She laughed and replied, "You'll thank me." At lunch, Ryan asked, "How are you really?" I paused and said, "Less numb." He nodded and said, "That's progress." I told him, I stopped asking why. He asked, "What do you ask now?" I said, "What next?" That night I stood in front of the mirror and said, "You survived." My reflection didn't argue. I called Clara and said, "I miss him." She replied, "That's normal." I asked, "Does it ever stop?" She said, "It changes." I admitted, "His absence still hurts." She answered, "But it doesn't own you." The next morning Ethan said, "You finished early." I said, "I focused." He replied, "That's self-respect." I laughed softly and said, "I forgot what that felt like." He said, "You're remembering." I walked past places Adrian and I once shared and said quietly, "This doesn't kill me." The words felt strange. I told Clara, "I didn't cry today." She said, "Tomorrow you might." I replied, "That's okay." I cooked dinner and said, "I'm feeding myself." No one answered, but I smiled. Before sleep I said, "I won't vanish." I added, "I'll build something new." The room stayed quiet. My chest felt lighter. I whispered, "What now?" And for the first time the question didn't scare me. I walked into work and said, "Good morning," without forcing it. Maya looked up and said, "You sound different." I replied, "Clearer." Jordan smiled and said, "Your report changed everything." I answered, "I just did the work." He said, "People noticed." During the meeting my manager said, "I trust your judgment." I nodded and said, "I won't waste it." The room stayed quiet and I felt taller. Later Maya whispered, "You're confident now." I said, "I'm focused." She replied, "It suits you." In the hallway I heard my name. I turned and saw Adrian. He said, "We should talk." I answered, "About what?" He hesitated and said, "Us." I replied, "There is no us." He frowned and said, "You've changed." I said, "I healed." He scoffed and said, "You think you're better?" I looked at him and said, "I think I'm free." His silence felt heavier than his words. Ethan later asked, "Did seeing him shake you?" I said, "It surprised me." He asked, "How so?" I replied, "I felt nothing." He nodded and said, "That's strength." I asked, "Or numbness?" He answered, "You can tell the difference." I sat across from him and said, "I still feel anger." He said, "Anger isn't weakness." I asked, "What is?" He replied, "Letting it drive." I told him, "Part of me wants revenge." He said, "What kind?" I answered, "The loud kind." He said, "And the quiet kind?" I thought and said, "Living well." He smiled and said, "That lasts longer." That afternoon Jordan said, "You should lead the next project." I blinked and said, "Me?" He replied, "You earned it." I called Clara and said, "They respect me." She laughed and said, "Of course they do." I said, "I forgot how that feels." She answered, "Never forget again." When Adrian texted, "I miss you," I stared at the screen. I typed, "I don't." Then I deleted it. I chose silence. Ethan later said, "Restraint is power." I replied, "It's harder than anger." He said, "That's why it matters." I stood by the window and said quietly, "I survived." No one argued. Maya passed by and said, "You inspire people." I replied, "I'm just honest." she said. That's rare. As I packed my bag, I said to myself, I don't need revenge. I added, I have momentum. Walking out, I felt steady. Not desperate. Not loud. Just strong enough to keep going. I looked at myself in the mirror and said, You're not the same woman anymore. Clara laughed softly and said, Good. I missed this version. I replied, I'm still meeting her. She asked, Do you miss him? I said, I miss who I thought I was with him. She nodded and said, That woman tried her best. At work, Jordan said, Everyone listens when you speak now. I answered, I don't rush anymore. He replied, That's leadership. During a meeting, Maya asked, What's your call? I said, We take the risk. She smiled and said, I trust you. Later, Clara whispered, You don't apologize for existing anymore. I said, I used to confuse love with shrinking. She replied, You grew instead. I caught myself thinking about Adrian and said out loud, He doesn't define me. Clara said, Say it again. I repeated, He doesn't define me. At lunch, Ryan asked, How did you get so calm? I answered, I stopped begging for clarity. He said, That's powerful. In my office, Ethan said, You hold space differently now. I asked, Is that good? He replied, It's earned. I told him, I made mistakes. He said, Everyone does. I added, I stayed too long. He answered, You left when it mattered. Clara called later and said, You sound peaceful. I said, I am. She teased, That scares men like him. I laughed and said, I'm not here to be digestible. She said, Exactly. When Adrian emailed, Can we talk? I didn't panic. I showed Clara and said, I don't owe him access. She said, Delete it. I did. At work, Jordan said, You changed the culture. I replied, I just set boundaries. He said, That's enough. I sat alone and thought, I don't need to be chosen. I said quietly, I choose myself. Maya passed by and said, You're confident. I answered, I'm honest. Ethan later asked, What do you want next? I said, Expansion. He smiled and said, You're ready. Clara texted, Proud of you. I replied, I finally am too. I wrote in my journal and whispered, I forgive myself. No one interrupted. That night, I realized becoming someone new didn't mean erasing the old me. It meant honoring her courage. I said one last time, I am enough. And I believed it. I was pouring coffee when Maya said, Have you heard about Adrian? I replied, No. She hesitated and said, Clients pulled out. I nodded and said, That happens. Jordan leaned closer and said, He's scrambling. I answered, I hope he figures it out. Maya raised an eyebrow and said, You're calm. I said, I don't need to watch closely. Jordan replied, People notice that too. Later, Adrian cornered me near the elevator and said, You've been avoiding me. I looked at him and said, I've been busy. He said, Everyone's turning cold. I answered, Maybe they see things clearly now. He scoffed and said, You think this is your win? I replied, I didn't compete. He lowered his voice and said, You could help me. I said, I won't. He asked, Why are you like this? I met his eyes and said, This is who I've always been. The doors opened and I stepped away. Maya later whispered, You handled that with grace. I said, I handled it with distance. She smiled and said, That's power. At lunch, Ryan said, People trust you. I asked why. He answered, You don't perform. I sat quietly and listened as Jordan said, Adrian blamed you. I said, He would. Jordan replied, No one believed him. That felt heavier than celebration. It felt final. Ethan joined me and asked, How does it feel? I said, Clean. He nodded and said, That's karma. I replied, I didn't plan it. He said, You didn't interfere either. When Adrian emailed again, Please talk to me, I didn't respond. I told Clara, I'm done explaining. She said, Good. She added, You look lighter. I answered, I stopped carrying his consequences. At work, Maya announced, "You're leading the new account." I blinked and said, "Me." She said. Everyone agreed. Jordan clapped and said, "Well deserved." I smiled and said, "Thank you." Adrian watched from across the room. He didn't approach. Ethan later said, "Silence teaches faster than anger." I replied, "I'm learning that." As I packed my bag, Ryan said, "You inspire trust." I answered, "I respect myself." In the hallway, Maya said, "You won." I said, "I moved on." That night, Clara asked, "Do you feel bad for him?" I said, "I feel finished." She laughed softly and said, "That's freedom." I sat alone and thought power doesn't shout. It waits. I whispered, "I didn't need revenge." The quiet agreed. I face Adrian in the quiet lobby and say, "You asked to see me." He says, "I needed this." I reply, "Make it honest." He swallows and says, "I destroyed us." I answer, "You chose yourself." He says, "I was afraid." I respond, "Fear isn't an excuse." He says, "I loved you." I reply, "You loved what I gave." He steps closer and says, "I regret everything." I say, "Regret doesn't rebuild trust." Maya stands nearby and whispers, "You're steady." I nod and say, "I am." Adrian says, "Can we fix this?" I answer, "No." He says, "I've changed." I reply, "I already outgrew you." Jordan watches quietly. Adrian says, "You're distant." I say, "I'm clear." He asks, "You won't forgive me?" I reply, "Closure isn't forgiveness." He says, "So this is it?" I answer, "This is enough." Ryan checks his watch and says, "We're waiting." I say, "I'm almost done." Adrian says, "You think you're above me?" I reply, "I value myself now." He says, "I lost you." I answer, "You let me go." His voice shakes and says, "I'm sorry." I reply, "I believe you." He asks, "Then why leave?" I say, "Belief isn't safety." Maya says, "She's right." Jordan nods once. Adrian says, "I never meant to hurt you." I reply, "Intent doesn't erase damage." He says, "I'm alone now." I answer, "So was I." He asks, "You don't miss us?" I reply, "I miss who I was." He whispers, "I still need you." I say, "You need yourself." Silence stretches. I feel calm. Adrian says, "This is goodbye." I reply, "It has been." Ryan opens the door. Maya squeezes my hand. I say, "Take care." Adrian says, "You too." I walk away steady and free. I spotted Adrian across the lobby, his eyes flicking toward me before dropping to the floor. My chest tightened, but I walked forward, keeping my voice even. "You asked to see me," I said, stopping a few feet away. "I needed this," he replied, his tone shaky, unsteady. "Then make it honest." I told him, arms crossed, refusing to let my emotions betray me. He swallowed. I destroyed us." I nodded slowly. "You chose yourself over me. That's what destroyed us." He flinched. "I was afraid, I didn't know how to." "Fear isn't an excuse, Adrian." My words were quiet but firm. "I loved you," he said, the vulnerability finally breaking through his arrogance. "You loved what I gave you," I said sharply. "Not me." He stepped closer. "I regret everything." "Regret doesn't rebuild trust," I replied. "And it doesn't erase the nights I cried alone wondering why you lied." He looked away. Can we fix this?" "No," I said, my voice steady. "We can't. Not because I don't want to, but because you can't. You gave yourself to someone else." "I've changed," he whispered. "I already outgrew you," I said calmly. Maya, standing near the doorway, nodded at me. "You're steady," she whispered. I gave a small, grateful smile. Adrian's shoulders slumped. "You're distant," he said, his voice cracking. "I'm clear," I told him. "Clear about what I deserve and what I won't tolerate." "You won't forgive me?" he asked. "Closure isn't forgiveness," I replied. "So this is it?" His voice broke. "This is enough," I said. Ryan glanced at his watch and I nodded. "I'm almost done," I told him. "You think you're above me," Adrian muttered, frustration mingled with fear. I value myself now, I said. You lost me, he said quietly, almost pleading. No, I said. You let me go. I'm sorry, he murmured. I believe you, I said simply, and for a moment I let the words hang without attachment. Then why leave? He asked. Belief isn't safety, I replied. Maya whispered. She's right. Jordan, standing just behind her, nodded once. I never meant to hurt you, Adrian said, his eyes desperate. Intent doesn't erase damage, I told him, calm and unflinching. I'm alone now, he admitted. So was I said. You don't miss us? He asked, voice softening. I miss who I was, I admitted, but not him. I still need you, he whispered. You need yourself, I said firmly. The silence stretched between us, heavy yet freeing. My chest no longer ached. This is goodbye, Adrian said. It has been, I replied. Ryan opened the door for me. Maya squeezed my hand. Take care, I said softly. You too, Adrian said, watching me leave, helpless in the quiet truth I carried. I stepped out into the sunlight, steady, free, and unburdened. My past remained behind, and for the first time in months, I smiled without hesitation. I sat on the balcony, the evening air brushing my cheeks, and Clara's voice rang in my memory. You've come so far, she had said, handing me a warm cup of tea. I don't feel far, I admitted, tracing the rim with my fingers. Sometimes I still feel that hollow space he left behind. Clara shook her head gently. That space doesn't define you. It just reminds you where you started. I laughed softly, a sound I hadn't heard from myself in months. I used to think my life ended with him. I thought losing him meant losing me. But you didn't, she said firmly. You found yourself again. I let her words sink in. I had rebuilt my routines, my friendships, my sense of worth. I had learned to smile without waiting for permission, to make choices for myself, not for someone else. I remember sitting on the floor that night, I said, voice barely above a whisper. Everything shattered and I felt small, invisible, like I didn't matter at all. You mattered, Clara said. And you matter now more than ever. You just needed to see it for yourself. I stared at the horizon. The city lights flickered below like tiny constellations. I did see it. Slowly. One decision at a time. One small victory after another. Clara smiled. And each one proved your strength. I never thought strength could feel quiet, I admitted. I expected it to roar, to demand attention. But this calm, steady feeling, it's better. It's real. You've earned it, she said. You deserve it. I nodded, letting the truth settle inside me. It's strange. I feel grateful for the lessons, the pain, even the betrayal. Without it, I might not have grown this much. Clara's eyes softened. Growth doesn't come from comfort. It comes from surviving the storms. I smiled at her. I survived. And I thrived. That's the difference. I don't dwell on him anymore. I don't replay his mistakes in my head. Good, she said. You don't need to. I took a deep breath. The air tasted like freedom and possibility. I remember the nights I thought I'd never move on. Now I see those nights weren't wasted. They were lessons, shaping me into someone who won't be shaken by deceit again. You've become whole, Clara said. Not because life was easy, but because you faced it bravely. I am whole, I whispered, feeling the truth resonate. Strong, aware, and capable of joy without needing validation from anyone else. That woman me, she's enough. Clara reached out, squeezing my hand. And she always was. I let the warmth of her touch and the certainty in my own heart settle in. The past was still a part of me, but it no longer ruled me. I could look back without breaking, honor the pain without being chained to it. I smiled to myself. I had walked through fire and emerged steady, unshakable, and ready for whatever came next. The applause was warm, steady, and real. I felt it in my chest, not just on the surface. Congratulations, Ethan said, handing me a folder. You've earned every bit of this. I smiled at him, a calm smile that had nothing to prove. Thank you, Ethan. I couldn't have done it without your guidance. He raised an eyebrow, amused. Guidance? You were doing all the heavy lifting yourself. I laughed softly. Maybe. But I learned how to carry it without breaking. A colleague nudged me gently. Everyone's talking about your project. Honestly, we didn't see anyone handling that level of responsibility so gracefully. I've had good mentors, I said. And a lot of quiet practice. Quiet practice? Ryan asked, smiling. That sounds deliberate. It was, I admitted. I made sure I was ready. No one else could define my strength. The crowd murmured around me, but my eyes sought only Clara. She grinned, nodding as if to say, you made it. I let the thought drift through me. Adrian wouldn't be here. He was irrelevant now. His absence no longer stung. It was a relief, not a wound. You've changed, Clara whispered when she leaned close. You're unshakable. I think I finally understand, I said, eyes steady on the horizon. Power isn't about control over others. It's about trust in myself. That's the only thing I need. Ethan nodded slowly. And now you have it. I see it in your decisions, your confidence, even in your calm. I feel it too, I admitted, letting the words settle. The past shaped me, but it doesn't rule me. I can make choices freely without fear or doubt. A junior colleague approached nervously. I just wanted to say, watching you handle all of this has been inspiring. I hope to be that composed one day. You already can be, I told her. You just need to trust yourself enough to act. She smiled, a flicker of hope in her eyes. Thank you. I turned back to the window, the city stretching below like a promise. This is my life now, I murmured. Every success, every choice mine. And it feels right. Clara's hand found mine. It always was waiting for you, she said softly. I squeezed it gently. I know. I just had to step into it fully. Ethan's voice carried lightly over the room. You've come a long way. Yes, I said, almost to myself. And I'm not looking back. The old fears, the betrayals, they don't touch me anymore. I am enough. I am capable. I am in control. A calm pride settled in my chest, steady and unshakable. The future was mine to shape, and for the first time I felt no hesitation. Here's to what comes next, I whispered, a promise to myself. Clara grinned. And we'll be cheering every step. I looked around one last time, taking in the faces, the acknowledgement, the respect. It was quiet, powerful, and real. For the first time I understood. I owned my life, my power, my peace. Adrian's shadow had no place here. And I smiled, knowing I had finally claimed everything that was truly mine.